Hello and welcome back to the M&E Drop-In. Today we've got a guest with us called Joe Lloyd from Paddeco. Joe has joined us previously on a podcast and is very knowledgeable in the area of competence, so he's come to talk to us today about competence. Joe, welcome back on the podcast.
Thank you very much for the invite. Nice to be back. Christmas special, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah. Merry Christmas to all.
Yeah, well, it's snowing outside, so it's definitely got that feeling.
Yeah.
So, been a little while since you last came on.
Yeah,
and a lot's happened since then. But before we
15 months.
delve into that, do you want to give us a bit of your background in the industry?
God bless
where
us.
you've come from, what you've done?
I think, my background is I started off in the petrochemical industry in the 70s as an apprentice. Moved into the HVAC sort of mid-80s, installation company and whatnot. Got involved with education and training. I used to enjoy training a lot of the lads. I used to work for Mitsui, then do some Babcocks. I used to run their ACE program and I used to run their training apprenticeship program. About training organisation, 2006. I left the industry 2011, tried to be normal. That didn't work. Came back about 2017 and I'm heavily involved in, if you like, the educational side of engineering. I enjoy that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Plenty of experience then.
Well, I can't make a lasagna. Let's leave that out of there. But I have a certain level of knowledge over here.
Great to hear. Okay, so like I said, that we want to talk about competence today because there's a lot been happening in that area. And I thought it would just be quite timely just to touch on the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 report, which came out a couple of months ago, some 7 years after the Grenfell incident.
Huge.
And the word competence is mentioned in that report, I think about 120 times. So a very topical point. And I just thought I'd pick out a couple of quotes from the report which touch on competence just to really set the scene. So one of the things I noticed in the introduction, they said, we have identified many errors due in most part to incompetence, carelessness, and failure to take responsibility for important aspects of the work that affected fire safety. And that was in the introduction. And then a bit later on in the report, there's another point in it. They also said, in our view, there is a great deal to be done to raise the overall level of competence of those in the construction industry. So it's a very topical point, and one thing I've heard a lot of people say recently is that the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 report was kind of written as if it was still in 2017, which you might say is a fair assessment. But I also think it's fair to say that there's a lot happened in the industry since then, since 2017. There's been a lot of changes, particularly as it relates to competence. And I wondered if you just make a start on that point, just outlining what some of those significant changes are that we've seen. Yeah,
I mean, obviously the most significant was 2022 when we've got an act of law, and obviously industry competence is front and centre then in item 35. Even in the last 15 months, we've seen quite a few changes. We've seen the introduction of the ICC, Industry Competence Committee. We've seen the formation of 5 super sectors now, interiors, civil, structure, the JCI, which is all the envelope sector, and Actuate, which is now the building services engineering. I think the main thing for me that's happened in the last 15 months was the development and release of the building regulations 2023, which that building regulation then was taken and inserted into the 2010 building regulations. It's called Part 2A of the building regulations, 11A to 11L. And it's significant. It's hugely significant. Mostly sometimes we think about building regulations, about the building, the structure and the fabric of the building. But that act's got nothing to do with the building. It's all about the competence of people involved in the design and the structure of that building. Yeah. So quite a few changes and they just keep coming.
So you mentioned there about the building regulations. Obviously, they've been around much longer than the Building Safety Act. Yeah. So how does the Building Safety Act link to the building regulations?
That's a good question. If we go back to the Health and Safety at Work Act, 1974, a lot of people are familiar with that act, and now we've got the Building Safety Act. So acts of law, they start off as bills. They're introduced to the House of Commons. They go through the House of Lords, and then they're signed off by a monarch. So they're given what's called royal assent. So the government make them into laws. Regulations, which the workforce are probably more familiar with, like Pure, Lola, Kosh, building regulations. Regulations are normally developed by government departments. And then they're signed off by the Secretary of State, called statutory instruments. They still got legislative powers. So you've got acts of law and then the regulations. A lot of the regulations are made to enforce what's in the act of law. Yeah. And certainly some of the building regulations are.
Okay, that's very interesting, Joe. So what are some of the the main points in the new regulations, and how does that relate to the Building Safety Act?
Yeah, I think the amendment to the building regulations, for me, is probably a lot of people are talking continually about the Building Safety Act. I would urge anyone to look at Part 2A of the building regulations with regards to competence and what's required. So, for instance, you'll see that you've got what's called 11A to 11O. 11A is the competence for a compliant client. So the client has legal obligations and competence requirements. If we take 11F, which is directly linked to item 35 of the Building Safety Act, you must have the skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours. So that's 11F. So you see a direct link then to the Building Safety Act. But the things like 11H is specific to principal contractors, 11K to principal designers. Some of the significant things for us certainly were that 11E specifically says that if you're not competent, you don't meet 11F, then you can't take the job on.
Okay.
And that is significant. Ultimately, we've been told competence, you have to be competent. Well, if you're not competent, meet 11F, and people wouldn't even know what 11F is.
So effectively, that's actually saying in law, if you're not competent, you must not take on the work.
You must not take that work on. It's under 11E, item 6. And what's also in the building regulations is 11I, a section that says you cease to be competent. At any time that you might cease to be competent, you must instruct and tell the principal contractor and the client. You might think, well, when would I stop being competent? A great example would be the ventilation sector.
Yeah.
Last year, we brought out specific standards for fire dampers and smoke control dampers called the BSEFSD, specifically with skills and knowledge. And that they only dropped last year. That means anyone in ventilation has never had them. So all of a sudden, you could make a case, well, actually, we've got brand new skills and knowledge. No one's got them. You cease to be competent.
Cease to be competent, interesting.
So that's a huge challenge now.
Yeah, so when a new standard comes out, then if you're not meeting that, that's an example of where you would.
The law says you must have the skills and knowledge.
Yeah.
If at any time you don't have the skills and knowledge, and that really opens the question that if we're going to bring new standards out, we need to think about how we're going to deliver them. Where's the provision to make sure that the workforce have got access to upskilling programs?
Okay, so another thing I've noticed that you've mentioned a few times in the past is the NOS, or National Occupational Standards, I think they're called.
Yeah.
What are they, and what role do they play?
Well, they play a pivotal role, not just in our industry, they play a pivotal role in society. There's a national occupational standards for virtually everything we do, from making a cocktail to getting your hair cut. And why they're really relevant is they contain defined skills and knowledge.
Okay.
So there's a national occupational standards for plumber, pipe fitter, on how they do their trade. And the law, remember, says that you must have the skills and knowledge. Well, ultimately, where are the skills and knowledge, and who writes them? So the skills and knowledge are in the National Occupational Standards, and they're written by what we call sector skills councils. Okay. And the sector skills councils, some people are familiar with them. CITB is a sector skills council. Okay. It's a sector skills council for construction, looks after all the construction trades. Yeah. BSc Skills Limited is a sector skills council for M&E, building service engineering, and they write national occupational standards. They review them every 5 years, and then they rubber stamp them. And then we make apprenticeship programs from the NOS. We make qualifications. So if the law says we must have the skills and knowledge for our occupation, it's probably important to start looking at national occupational standards and to see how then we can achieve them. And they can be achieved. Some awarding bodies do a reflection of NOS. Some awarding bodies use them directly and put them into qualifications.
Okay, so where a qualification is concerned, then that it is the NOS that defines what the skills and knowledge is.
Yeah.
I see.
There'll be some competency frameworks built later on, but that's another story, and we'll end up clashing with that. But the NOS are great proof for competence. If I'm going to be in a court of law and I must have the skills and knowledge to climb up that scaffold and put that bracket up, where's that? That's in the BSc 01 and the 4999 now for the brackets in. So NOS play an important part. They're made on a 4-nation basis, so forget whether they're in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and then they're signed off and the professional standards they call.
Okay, so another question I had, and I appreciate it's probably a bit disconnected from the last one. CSCS cards.
Okay.
So tell me about them. How do they link to competency?
There's 38 partners with the CSCS program and schemes. I think what we should ask is, what are they trying to do? what do they do and what don't they do with regards to competence.
Okay.
So I think it would be fair to say that the CSCS card is trying to be some sort of competence card or confirmation that someone holds competence. I think for me personally, where it started to fail is giving them cards out with no qualification. And obviously that's industry accreditation. It should never have happened. And ultimately, that's a failure of good governance and leadership. I do think that with regards to the CSCS, they need to be very mindful now that competence is a legal requirement. So if you give someone a card, what gives you the authority to give them that card? And a great example would be the green card. You know, I hear this sort of labourer's card. Forget that statement.
Yeah.
The fact is the law said you must be competent or working towards competency. Now, if you issue a card by answering some knowledge questions and health and safety, the law says you must have the skills and knowledge. And the health and safety standards, let's say 641, 642 for construction, they contain skills. The BSc, BSc 01, M&E, they contain skills that are achievable. So we can't tell people that they can start going up and working on a scaffold because they answer knowledge questions. I don't get given a driving license because I do a DVLA theory test. So, okay, we need competency cards, that's fine. But don't be issuing them unless you can prove competency. So yeah, with the CSCS, I do think there needs to be open, transparent talking. If they bring another green card out, lights flashing. Any project manager then taking that on site is basically then that card saying I'm not qualified and I'm not working towards any type of qualification. Regardless of their occupation, the first thing they should have is the health and safety standards that we approved. And if they are not linked to that card, then that card for me puts people in legal jeopardy.
Okay, interesting. So as an example then, I could have a skill card.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean I'm legally competent.
No. And in particular, obviously with skill card, which is more our card for our sector, I think there's tens of thousands of skill cards out there, certainly with industry accreditation, that's put people in basically legal jeopardy. There's this fictitious date of the 31st of December 2024. That date doesn't matter. The law was passed on the 28th of April 2022 for competence. You know, it's a bit like saying, well, you need a driving license from that date. I've still got this provisional one. No, that's where the date was, not when you set it. So, yeah, I mean, there'll be people out there now contravening the building regulations every day and they wouldn't even know. However, they're victims of organisations and bodies that have told them they're okay.
Yes.
And what they're doing. And ultimately, there's a liability for that for me. People have got to remember competence is a legal requirement. So if you're involved at any point telling people they're competent, then you take that liability on.
So taking the assumption that a skills card, for example, is automatically making you competent, is putting you in legal jeopardy.
Absolutely. Answering knowledge questions every 5 years about health and safety does not make you competent. I mean, the BSc, BSc 01, the health and safety standard with skill card, that's at level 3. You know, we're a skilled sector. We're marking out, we're measuring.
Yeah.
You know, that's what we do. So the health and safety standard is the very minimum for anyone to walk on the site. For skill card to issue a green card where you're not basically achieved the health and safety standard, you know, for someone like me, I do a lot of auditing, that for me is malpractice there. And ultimately, it should be seized.
Wow, that's quite a statement, Joe. So clearly there's some challenging times ahead. Can you just touch on what some of the challenges are that await the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There is some challenging times ahead. You know, there's a lot of people out there at the minute just trying to navigate the way through, if you like, this competence. It's new to them. I think the biggest thing for me will be the implementation. What does that mean? I think because we've got a lot of changes with regards to competence, the problem you've got is the law. And the law literally says if you're not competent, you must be working towards. If we make new competency frameworks, which are getting developed as we speak, how are we going to implement them? That must be the biggest challenge, that we face now, that we don't place people in legal jeopardy all of a sudden. I think a lot of the safety officers have got an upfront role to play, like the supervisors. But the safety officers are often used to walking around sites, doing safety audits, looking at the working environment for trip hazards and signs, making sure the workforce has got PPE on. They might look at the documentation, the safe systems of work that we've got and the RAM set. But competence isn't there. The whole job could go great.
Yeah.
Competence is in basically the CVs And so the safety officers now are faced with looking at a selection of cards, a CV. They've got to look at the standards of the job. And they've got to look at legislation and see gaps. And that's a different skill set for the health and safety officer. And that's what we've tried to do with some of the companies, clients we work with. We tried to encourage them to develop internal committees. So we call them, and sort of cradle like this, Competence for Compliance Committee, to encourage the health and safety officers working within the companies to then form an internal competence and compliance committee, and then invite people like myself along and have an agenda so they can start looking at the hazard that they don't normally see. You know, in the 80s, people hanging upside down on jobs, they could see it. Before the management regs in 99, we could see that we needed permits and whatnot. But the hazard now is not easily seen.
Yeah, can you just expand on that a bit more? So what can companies do to meet these changes? Yeah,
first of all, we're instructed, certainly in the 8672 and in the building regs, to seek professional skills. We're instructed that you're not going to know every single thing there is. You know, certainly some of the tier ones, they've got 1,000 people on a site. They're not going to know, the competence for every single trade. So we're basically directed to go and seek help, like people like myself. Remember that some of these companies are experts at what they do.
Yeah,
they're technically brilliant at what they do. Some of them have got great systems in place. But as I said before, they might have been installing a system and a component for many years brilliantly, and all of a sudden someone brings a license to do that. And in particular, my sector, ventilation, where we haven't got any traditional apprenticeship routes. We've got people that's been upskilled who don't necessarily have the knowledge. So as I say, we try to encourage our clients to have basically start off with a company competence for compliance committee that starts to address competence. What is it? And what we try to get them to do is do a skills diagnostic on their workforce. The standards for that, by the way. So the CLD, LD standards are...
So is that like creating a bit of a matrix for your organisation in terms of where competency starts and stops?
Training matrix is great. So basically there's a national occupational standards for the identification of the needs of an individual and a collective group. A method statement's a good place to start. A lot of companies have got method statements. There's a sequential of what we do, how we do the job. And ultimately then try and create that committee where we're looking at the CVs, the training matrices. And then if you're not sure, bring someone in and say, listen, basically, can you look at our training matrix? I do a lot of analysis. That's what I do a lot of, where I'll basically look at the training matrix. I'll look at everyone's CVs. I'll look at the working practice, but I'll look at the law. And then basically I'll try and come up and plug those gaps. What we also do, we try to encourage some of the main supervisors to be part of the process of any upskilling. They're experts at what they do. They know the workforce. A bit like, how can they be part of the process then of competence? It's a bit like giving our sons and daughters maybe a driving lesson. What's the difference between giving them a driving license? So we introduce the supervisors, if you like, to be part of what's called an expert witness program, and then part of the assessors program. We do a lot of that on the nuclear sector, which is difficult to get into certain buildings. So there is support, there is help out there, and I would encourage any company to basically create that internal group and committee. They'll have one anyway, but it's just an extra arm, open an agenda. I sit on several. I get invited, and to support.
That's good. That's great advice. Thanks, Joe. So what other aspects of competence should companies be looking out for?
What we've been directed to do with competence, gone are the days of my generation doing a qualification and going to work for 50 years. Those days are going. Gone. So what we're being told is about the maintaining of competence, certainly with the aspect of validation and revalidation. I don't think there'll be any worker in the next 5 to 7 years that's not part of an upskilling, new qualification or a competence person scheme that won't have a direct observation on them in site. So that's going to be really challenging because we haven't got as many adjudicators, we haven't got as many assessors in the country, certainly again in my sector. So that I think you'll start to see the competence person schemes really start to play a part. But I'll talk about them again because some of them need to be looked at. If you run a scheme that says installation, installer, or person, then the government and UCAS clearly say that there should be a direct observation on the installer of basically what they're installing that component. They're not there to be in your office. Competence person scheme is about a person. It's a bit like an MOT will tell you of a component. It'll tell you of a system meeting the specification, but an MOT won't tell you the competence of a driver. It's a different judgment process, and that's what a lot of these competence person schemes or schemes under the microscope will be looked at.
Okay, that's interesting. So you mentioned a few minutes ago about the associations that tend to play a bit of a role in the industry. When it comes to associations, what can or what should they be doing with regards to competence and helping their members?
That's a great question. Again, I'll just stick to sort of my sector in building services engineering. We've got some proactive associations. We've got some, for me, that tread in water to a degree. Associations normally from a technical point of view are very strong. Technically, they know, and their members know what they're doing. Although, if you look at my sector, ventilation, we haven't got a single apprentice in the country in ventilation. We had COVID nearly 5 years ago now. Everyone's talking about indoor air quality, yet we don't have a single apprentice route ventilation. That's a failure. It's also worth remembering that some associations are also part of the Sector Skills Council, so they come with added responsibility. So some of the associations will be thinking about their members and looking after the members' sort of needs, whereas some associations are part of the Sector Skills Council. Well, they should also be looking at the needs of the sector, making sure we have standards, make sure we have apprenticeships, make sure we have the provision of apprenticeships. And the sector's not there just to feed them. They are there in a responsible position to meet the needs of the sector. So when we have parts of our sector that doesn't have a single apprentice in the country, I do get a bit irate. But technically, they're very solid. And I just think they're a bit of a fish out of water when it comes to making understanding about competence and judgments. That's why we see a raft of 2-day courses, because they already think, well, we're experts in what we do anyway. But if you ask any of them what the health and safety standard are, they wouldn't know. So I think there needs to be more collaboration with the associations. It's a bit like a Game of Thrones above there, some associations against the others. Maybe I think ultimately the law and legislation will bring them together. It'll be interesting the role of the super sectors. Yeah. And I think the super sectors, certainly building services and engineering, actuate how that will basically bring a lot of them associations together. They've all got something to offer, and there's some excellent knowledge within there. I just think over the years that there's been more of a sort of like a self-serving sort of criteria of looking after their own rather than what about the sector. No, I could go on and on about that, I tell you.
No, that's really interesting. Thanks, Jay. Another thing I just wanted to touch on here was 2020, obviously the CLC brought out the, I think it's called Directive of Minimum Competence.
It did, yeah.
Can you outline what that is, and is that still relevant now that we have, Part 2A?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think originally we've seen the first directive from the CLC, which is the Construction Leadership Council, and it was making directives on anyone that held a CSCS card at the time. So it was in 2015, 2017, there was another review. But in 2020, it clearly states that the minimum requirement would be a level 2 qualification, MECA level 2, level 5 in the SCQF for competence. Obviously, I don't think that was followed too much. It links in also to, I think, the CDM, which is 2015. And there's a HSE guidance, the L153, which states that industry cards should not be used for competence. But MVQs and SVQs should be the basis for anyone managing that site. And I think somewhere along the line, we just failed to implement those issues. Certainly, we're talking 2020 with the CLC saying a minimum of a level 2 qualification for a CSCS card, and we're still issuing CSCS cards without no qualification, which is a bit nonsensical 5 years later, isn't it?
Yes. Okay, so clearly some challenging times ahead then, Jay.
Yeah.
So I just want to, try and relate it to somebody that might be an operative on site or a contractor, for example, maybe a project manager. If they observed that the legal requirements for competence were not being met on a construction project, what should they do about it? What can they do about it? Is there a mechanism for them being able to report that? What's the process that should be followed?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's that that hazard that's not seen. I mean, in simple terms, any project manager that gets issued a card, turn it over. The card is not the competence. The qualifications and behind it, they can support it, but not just the card.
Yeah.
Certainly a green card. There's a few reporting mechanisms from the Building Safety Act. One's called mandatory occurrence report in the MOR, which we're instructed to embed. There's a VOR as well. That's going to be common. So that's the voluntary occurrence reporting. But like any hazard, ultimately it should be reported to line managers, supervisors. We wouldn't send people, to the supplier in a van knowing they haven't got a driving license because we know that's a criminal act. But we were born into that law. A lot of us understand that law. We understand, that to prove competence of driving a car, like someone makes a judgment on my performance, someone makes a judgment on my knowledge. We need to start moving that thought process over to all our working roles. So if we do see competence, and as we're told before, you cease to be competent, we need to act on it. Like basically it's something's burning. There's a hazard there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hazards now that's been documented. And there was a government directive sent to building control clearly stating to look for evidence of non-compliance to 11A to 11O. So those building regulations of competence, the government have instructed building control to go and look for evidence of non-compliance. So as I said before, it would be like me and you going to Nottingham doing an audit on a delivery organisation where we've got names, dates, times, destinations, and then we realise no one has a driving licence. There's the hazard. And ultimately, there's going to be the similar. If you let someone on site and you've taken a picture of their card, and on the back of it, there's nothing.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there's a hazard there of competence. I must admit, the tier ones, tier twos, and tier threes are putting a lot of effort now into before you even get to site on sort of the procurement and what they require. And that is having an effect, and I think a positive effect to try and, if you like, nullify anyone working on site who would be contravening the building regulations and leaving people in legal jeopardy.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That's interesting. So competence isn't actually something that's new to the industry, is it? It's been in the regulations for a long time. For example, Regulation 7 touches on it. I think it talks about products being applied, used or fixed in a workmanlike manner, which essentially is the same thing. So if we already had competence in the building regulations, why then did we need Part 2A?
I think because of the implementation. I think you're right. We had guidelines, we had regulations, like say even in the CDM in 2015, but it just wasn't enforced. And there lies the issue, doesn't it? Ultimately, it needs to be enforced. And certainly, everything now links back to item 35 of the Building Safety Act. That is primary legislation, where as before there were regulations, they now, if you like, have a lot more legislative sort of like force. But we need to have change. We can't carry on. We can't have people, sort of like basically the tragedy that happened at Grenfell. It needs to change. And I think the good lady was right that the culture and the attitude of some needs to change. We've got the laws there now, and I think there'll be a few enforcements coming along in the next couple of years. Okay,
you mentioned earlier about ceasing to be competent, and you gave some examples of that. But in order to be able to, for that to happen, would we first have to understand the limits of our own competence, do you think?
Yeah, great question as well, because that's in some of the criteria of standards. In the A672, I think, as well, it says something in some of the standards and new quals of understanding the limitations of your own competence. And ultimately, you're in the realms of learning development now standards. What is that? Learning development standards are where judgments have made. Okay. So the likes of you are assessor, well, that's standard 9. Ultimately, the reflection of your own practices is standard 10. So knowing the limitations of your own competence is vitally important, because we don't want to be making judgments on the competence of people if we're not competent ourselves. Yeah. Going back to the driving, you've got no right to give your son a driving license. Oh, fine, that's okay. I know what I'm doing. And that is a grey area for many people. It's not, they're very good at what they do, but it doesn't give you the authority to do that. Yeah. Just because we do a first aid class doesn't mean I'm going to go in the operating theatre on Monday. No, know the limitations of your own competence. I got a driving license doesn't mean I can drive an Arctic truck. Doesn't mean I can start flying a helicopter. And there's a lot there now that's pushing down in the 8670 of making people try to question whether they have the authority to basically say someone's competent or make a judgment of competence. And that, that'll be a challenge in itself.
So the phrase that we hear quite often, I've always done it this way.
It might be the wrong way, and you might, and maybe you shouldn't have done it. Yeah. I mean, I think I've said before. I mean, I've got the competence to rewire your home, or, replace your boiler. From an engineering point of view, it doesn't mean I should.
Yes,
I'm sure we've all taken engines apart in the cars. Now we can't, as such. So, basically question, what you're doing and make sure that you have the authority to do it.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. One of the things I wanted to touch on was just going back to the Building Safety Act. There's clearly a distinction in there when it comes to HRBs, high-risk residential buildings. So when it comes to the competence requirements, does that just relate to HRBs or is it all buildings?
All buildings. I think, to be fair, when we started seeing the first directives and communication come out, I think it was high-rise buildings.
Yeah,
I think that was a non-starter at some point. And then we moved to high risk. The directive sent to government about the building regulations, 1st of October 2023, literally says all buildings. So that competence, part 2A, basically is all buildings in the sector. And that's the way it should be looked at.
Okay, that's great. Okay. So we've also got the building safety regulator, which I don't think we might have touched on it briefly earlier. How do you expect them to police the competency requirements? And if people fail to meet them, what sort of penalties do you think can be expected?
Well, obviously the building safety regulator has been live now for 12 months.
Yep.
We had a sort of period before that. And what's important, I think, is the building safety regulator is the building control for high-risk buildings in England. So I suspect that they've been cutting their teeth for the last sort of 13 months on the front line, dealing with daily issues every day in them high-risk buildings. The law is there for the enforcement. And certainly, I think that's item 39. There's also item 40 of enforcement of bodies of directors. So there's a lot of law that's in place. I still think, and obviously we talked about the MOR before, the reporting. The law's in place, the reporting's in place. I still think with regards to competence, even the building safety regulator, that's got to say, well, what does it look like? Whether it's the new competency frameworks, which might start crashing against the NOS. And then we've got government standards over here. And what I do think will certainly happen, we're not going back. I think there's a lot of grey areas over here of what the building safety regulator is going to do and why isn't this being enforced.
Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns, isn't there? Yeah.
It's not going to go backwards. And ultimately, we'll eventually all be on the same page. I think we're just taking different directions and destinations to get there, but we will be on the same page. I think there's a few prosecutions on the way. Yeah, I certainly think after reading phase 2 of the report, and I do feel for some people, there's a lot of project managers and supervisors out there who won't understand the legislation. Like you said before, they've always done it this way, and they're very good at what they do. I've been out further education for a long time, and certainly my sector in ventilation. And I do feel for them, and a lot of the times they're the ones we're actually battling for because they don't know. Again, it goes back to they've been driving that car for years, and then someone says, "Get a license." Well, how do we get that? Well, do I need it? So we've got to protect them. Yeah,
and as you rightly say, we're yet to see the net result of the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 report and what prosecutions happen off the back of that, which over the coming months and years we should be starting to see. And once that starts to come through, hopefully, maybe that'll make people start to pay more attention to the change. Culture change takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. I think the fatalities, I think people forget we have fatalities every year in our industry. I think it's similar to when there's an investigation of a crash in a car, the first thing is, where's the license? Yeah. So I think the fatalities that's happening in the construction and engineering sector, you'll start to see the first question is, should they have been there? Yeah. Regardless of what they're doing. Where's the authority for them to be there? And pulling out a plastic card and saying, oh, I'm competent, barrister's going to get all of that, rip it to shreds.
Yeah. One of the other things which came into the Grenfell Inquiry report was about a licensing scheme under a single regulator for principal contractors. What's your thoughts about that, and how is that an option for how competency might be able to be regulated in the industry, do you think? I think anything proposal is worth a debate. My only
sort of question there was any scheme, and we see a few schemes. First of all, it's got to be legal.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if someone's going to step forward and say, right, you're under this umbrella and you are now legal and competent, are we? There's several schemes out there at the minute, certainly third-party schemes, that they were a bad product 3 or 4 years ago. Now they're an illegal product. I said it before, if you're going to say competence person or installation installer, you're making a judgment on the person. And there's a lot of schemes that are not even doing that at the minute. I've got a personal sort of grievance sometimes that we seem to be seeing a lot of schemes, a lot of bodies that are going to tell the workforce and the companies what they're doing wrong, and they should be doing this, this, and this. Yep, I don't see any of them investing in the apprenticeship program. And keep going back to mine, there's not a single apprentice. It reminds me of sort of looking at a conveyor belt where we've got products on the conveyor belt and they're defective, competence, and we're trying to sort out and fix it on the conveyor belt. Well, where's the supplier? We need to go back, if you like, and could we do more for competence at the beginning rather than start to change it at bad habits? And there's a lot of sectors out there that have got some good practices. Certainly, I think there's a lot to learn from other sectors with regards to education, training in engineering construction.
So a lot of what we've discussed, Joe, in the last few minutes has been about the skills and knowledge. Building Safety Act defines competence actually as skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours.
Yeah.
So if we take skills and knowledge, and to some degree experience as well, they're all measurable to some degree.
Yeah.
The one which perhaps doesn't seem that way, and perhaps the most intangible of them, is behaviours. So how can the industry articulate what good behaviour is, and how can contractors make sure that they're meeting the legal benchmark, the legal behavioural benchmark for competence?
Yeah, and that's the one, isn't it? Behaviours is a legal requirement. I think the measuring won't be too bad. The delivery of it could be challenging.
Yeah.
We've, certainly in building service engineering and construction, we've got standards related to working relationships.
Yeah.
So there's some criteria there about we expect people to behave a certain way.
Yeah.
It's been magnified now in the BSI 8670.
Okay.
So there's a table in there, and that's got criteria about ethics, honesty. So there's behaviours that we can measure there. We've been through this before. I think I mentioned about people hanging upside down in the 80s and 90s of scaffolds and whatnot. What happened in 99 was the introduction of the management regs.
Yeah.
And what the management regs did, it pushed risk assessment front and centre.
Yeah.
So we had sites with steel toe cap flip-flops, if you like. We had people hanging upside down, and then we had the introduction of the management regs, which changed the tier 1s and tier 2s of putting safe systems in place. So the behaviours have started to change of safety because of legislation. And then all of a sudden, if we didn't have a site induction, people say, well, I had a site induction last week.
So that's an example of where legislation has changed behaviours in the past.
For the best, for the better. It wasn't so much the qualifications, it wasn't so much the associations, it was the tier 1s because of legislation changed the safe working practices within our construction industry. And as I said before, we do a lot of work on the nuclear sector, and the behaviours there is just ingrained into them. How they work, what they do, what they're supposed to report. I do think it might be a generational thing that we need to, if you like, the norm for the youngsters coming into a construction site. It is better. Certainly, obviously, I remember
in the same way that a risk assessment, for example, is the norm now.
Yeah.
Maybe a few years down the line,
the behavioural will be
demonstrating of competence will be just a natural thing to do because that's what we do, and that's what the law states, rather than it being this new high benchmark that we have to meet.
Yeah, so I think we can measure it. I think the teaching of it will be the challenging bit of teaching that. But we're starting to see a lot of that, certainly with new challenges, certainly with mental health. We have the same with that. How do we teach that? So I have no doubt we'll address it. But you're right. We've got to remember that it's a legal requirement for behaviours. It's not just the skills and knowledge. It's about behaviours that's legal.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I wanted to also talk about the skills gap in construction because I've got some stats here from the CPA, which I think are pretty interesting. So in the 2024 quarter 2 report, they reported that there was 2.04 million works in construction, which is 5.1% lower than a year previous, which is quite a significant decrease. And it was also 15.9% lower than at the recent peak in Q1 of 2019.
Yeah.
What do you see as the cause of this, and what impacts is this decline likely to have over the next few years, do you think?
I think with regards to apprenticeship programs, and certainly building service engineering, I think the skill card, the CSCS card, didn't do apprenticeships any favours. There was no need to do an apprenticeship.
Yeah, okay.
Certainly,
So
again,
essentially disincentivised.
in ventilation,
Yeah.
we had 3 apprenticeship programs in the 90s. All 3 disappeared virtually overnight because you didn't need to do one. You could just get a card, you could walk on site and do some work with your mate. So I do think the apprenticeship program, it has to come back. I think right across. I think COVID changed a lot on how we deliver apprenticeships. I think certainly with regards to building service engineering and some construction, we've got to look at how often the employer is going to lose that learner.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on now with the core units that the government developed for building service engineering and construction. So we've seen 17 to 19-year-olds doing a core unit and then going into work. And that might be a way of sort of like doing a lot more knowledge and then going to work. Different to sort of like that, let's lose the apprentice 1 day a week.
Yeah.
Certainly if he's migrating, he's working in different parts of the
definitely.
cities. So I think that the machine itself needs to be looked at. It will be interesting with Skills England. And if you're listening to Skills England, happy to help. No one else will have me. With the apprenticeship program. I think technology and AI will certainly play a part. And I've seen a lot of the AI delivery, which which is really interesting. We need a skilled workforce in this country.
Yeah.
We need an apprenticeship program that works. And at the minute in building service engineering, it doesn't work.
Yeah. One of the stats I noticed on apprenticeships is we currently have a 40% dropout rate. So exactly right there is an example of why we see this declining size of the construction workforce. And obviously you've got what's happening with the grandfather rights and so on. So what role do you see apprenticeships playing in the industry moving forward to create a skilled workforce?
I think Skills England have got a huge job in advertising and making our sector attractive. I think from a financial point of view, it's starting to be attractive. Because ultimately some of the money that these people are earning out there is a lot of money. I just think the delivery is key. I think the products is also a key thing. I think you just need the right people around the table. Ultimately, you can't tell me that we haven't had a failure in governance and leadership for apprenticeships. It's failed. As simple as that. I think the grandfather rights. Ultimately, why have you got a grandfather rights program? Ultimately, that's an example of a failure of a career pathway. We should never have had industry accreditation. It should never have been introduced because ultimately there was the death of certainly from my sector. The minute the industry accreditation came in, ventilation apprenticeships disappeared. Completely disappeared. And now we're struggling now because we've got no teachers, assessors who normally would get to a certain age level and they go and get a job in the local college. So I don't see how apprenticeships will be solved in the next 3 to 5 years in building service engineering. I mean, we've got no apprenticeship programs. If we could have 1,000 apprenticeships tomorrow. We haven't got any programs. So they'll need to be looked at. So you've got the law pushing down for competence. You've got ventilation's a great example because ventilation's never lost a generation to retirement. So you see it come along in the late 70s, early 80s, and the 60s, that generation. So in the next 10 years, they'll go. They've never been replaced. And so ultimately, you're seeing an expanding sector, indoor air quality, LEV, kitchen extracts, fire, dampers. See, it's growing, but ultimately you've got no, you've got no, if you like, new generation coming through. So that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to what's ahead in the industry because, we've got the government bringing out new targets for building houses, for example. You've got a declining construction workforce. You've got an apprenticeship problem which is struggling to backfill the shrink in the workforce. So there's clearly some challenging times ahead. There's also I'd say for companies and individuals that are really interested in doing it right, there's plenty of opportunity there as well.
Yeah. I mean, if we take some of the other sectors as an example, again, back to the petrochemical and power station. I think it was the turn of the century or just before the new century that the average age in that sector was 58, 59.
Yeah. Okay.
So they could see the average age. They had the same challenges with competence. So they brought out what's called an ACE card, short competency in engineering. And they basically upskilled everyone who had indentures, my generations, to an MVQ level 3. So they drew a line and said, there's your competence. What it did, it stimulated the investment for training providers. Now that sector, if you like, all the mechie fitters, pipe fitters, welders, all that sector now is thriving. It's got a robust apprenticeship program. It's got a career pathway within there. And obviously that's a nuclear industry is an expanding industry. Why we don't follow that method over here, I don't know. They have what's called a SWEPS pack. So basically it's suitably qualified, experienced people.
Okay.
So basically it's like a giant CV with 25 to 30 pieces of certificates, evidence. They get assessed continuously. They're on programs. So if you take a pipe fitter in that sector, he sends us his SWEPS pack. You take a pipe fitter, let's say in London in a plant room, one sends us a plastic card and the other sends us a box of everything.
Yeah.
So you can see that worked.
Yeah.
There was an ongoing upskilling program that worked. So it's not as if we haven't got the examples of what we should do.
Yeah, just touch on that a bit more, because you've mentioned some of these other parallel industries like nuclear or petrochemical, for example. But what can we, when it comes to competency, what can the construction industry and the built environment learn from these other parallel industries?
Leadership and governance. You don't wander onto a petrochemical, because your mate says, come and give me a hand. You'll get through the gate. Ultimately, you've got a safety passport just to get on there. That's a 2-day course. As such, on health and safety, you must be working towards a qualification and have a qualification. And as I say, they brought a competency card out, minimum level 3 to get it. Yeah. I think there was only the thermal at a level 2 at the time. We brought a card out, and we said we've been doing it for years. There you go. That there was a failure. And that's a failure of governance and leadership. That's not looking down the line.
No.
And that's, for me, where we need to look and say, well, okay, that works now. We've got a thriving sector there. We need to transport what they did right, into this.
Yeah.
I could go on and on there.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think, we touched on earlier the associations and the role they play. There's plenty of opportunity from a leadership point of view, that they could look to these industries to see where it is working really well.
Yeah.
And try and implement some of those learnings and so on.
It will be interesting what Skills England do. Ultimately, we built the world a couple of generations ago. We're the head of engineering and construction. Couple of generations ago, and to see it struggling, to see what happened at Grenfell, for me, there's the warning bells. And I think Dame Judith was absolutely right. We need to change the culture and attitudes of some people. We need to clear the decks. We need to let the new generation come in with driving ideas. Yes, we need to probably change the delivery of apprenticeship programs, but there's a lot of talent out there. We just need to nurture it and capture it.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. So in the building services support niche, where we're dealing with support bracketry and fixings all the time, what are the standards and what are the things we should be paying attention to when it comes to competence?
I think first of all, you do some internal educational training, which is very good. And I know that you're looking to do a bracketry qualification. I mean, the standards, if we look at the COS VR 802, which is the National Occupational Standards, which is good. Remember, it's got skills and knowledge in for the actually fixing. And the 803 is the testing. So they're the standards that we can sort of look to, if you like, for your qualification. Yeah. And the 499 is the bracketry and assembly. We need to start questioning that ultimately, where are the skills and knowledge to fix a split fix into that concrete floor? Yeah. Where are the standards? Do they exist? Well, we do. There's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of technical knowledge. Now it's about actually proving that. And I think it'll end up being an upskilling program at some point. There are a lot of people out there. And the BSc 01 is your health and safety standard for actually getting on the steps or the scaffold. And that would need to be ingrained in there. But it's about realistically taking your technical knowledge, turning that into basically a skills and knowledge qualification of course, and then ratifying that. And I think that's commendable for you to look into that for your own sort of clients and supports the sector in general. And that probably should be in every apprenticeship in the country. Because we all put fixings in, we all do bracketry.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That's some really good advice. So last question, I guess, then, and one that we always like to check in there. What's one thing that you would change about the industry?
And we're going to throw under a bus here. I think the biggest thing for me is apprenticeships.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever started off being involved in educational training. But to be part of giving someone a skill and a knowledge that then they go on and provide for the family is a good thing. Mm. I think there's times, certainly over the last few, X amount of years, where I feel like I've got one hand behind my back to be told that ultimately, no, you can't do this. And to be sat here with not a single apprentice in the country in my sector is so frustrating. Mm-hmm. So what would I change? I would change that. Not too sure how, but that's what I would change.
That's great. Good to hear.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. So thanks for coming along. It's been great to have you. You're welcome to come on anytime.
Thanks for the invite, mate. And happy Christmas and happy New Year to everyone out there.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that.
Thanks
and to those watching and listening, thanks for your time. And look out for future episodes of the M&E Drop-In podcast. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, Joe.